Becoming Beauvoir a Life by Kate Kirkpatrick. 2nd. The Dutiful Daughter. As a small child, Simone remembered her family with a rapturous sense of belonging. But from the age of 11 onwards, she began to feel increasingly confused by what was expected of her, and shocked that what she wanted to become was not what her family wanted her to be. They had raised her to be precocious, to read, to question, so why did they tell her to stop thinking, stop reading, stop questioning? She began to feel miserable and unhappy, in part because of her unanswered questions and in part because she was witnessing an unwelcome transformation in someone she loved. As a girl, Beauvoir thought her father a rarity among men. No one she knew rivaled his wit, his brilliance, his wide reading, his ability to recite poetry, or his passion in argument. He enjoyed acting and loved being the life of the party. But the family's misfortune eventually cost him even his good humor. The boulevardier, the man about town, was D-class and dispirited. After the First World War, Georges de Beauvoir's already precarious fortunes took a turn for the worse. His investments in pre-revolutionary Russian stocks were now worthless, and suddenly the family had only his earnings to live on. Simone overheard vexed conversations about money. Ois could not understand why Georges would not return to law. Georges offered a retaliatory reminder that things would be different if her dowry had been paid. Their passion for each other was now mixed with bickering and spite. One night, when Simone returned home with Louise, her mother had a swollen lip. The truth was that Georges could not afford to return to legal practice. He didn't have the capital to pay for office rent or furniture or any of the things needed to start the business, let alone the means to support the family while waiting for his business to become profitable. He was 40 and had already had 2 heart attacks. He lacked the health, the means and the will to do what Ois wanted. Fortunately for Georges, the previously disgraced Gustave Brasser Ois's father, had a habit of landing on his feet and came to his son-in-law's rescue. For the last 2 years of the war he had been the director of a shoe factory. He had secured military contracts for boots and shoes, making his business highly profitable, and so offered Georges the role of co-director. This was not a seemly profession for a Bertrand de Beauvoir, but he had no alternative but to accept. He treated his title as honorary and worked irregularly, only when it could not be avoided. After the war, the demand for military boots died out, and so did the factory's prosperity. Once again Georges was rescued by a family member, who offered him a role as a newspaper advertising salesman. Since he was neither a natural salesman nor a reliable worker, that work too was soon lost. From then on, he drifted from one role to the next. His daily habits cost him several jobs. Despite his family's straitened circumstances, Georges rose at 10 a.m., went to the stock exchange around 11 a.m. to be seen, ate lunch, briefly visited his office, played bridge all afternoon, had an evening drink at the cafe and then went home for dinner. According to H. L. Nee, Simone always spoke too charitably of their father. In H. L. Nee's view, all the men in the Beauvoir family were lazy and did not like to work. The women are the strong ones who did it all and saved face for the men. It seems unlikely that Beauvoir's generous depiction of her father was motivated by genuine affection in view of what later years had in store, but it is possible that some kind of family loyalty moved her to paint him in flattering tones. A more compelling possibility is that Beauvoir knew, by the time she was writing her memoirs in the mid-1950s, that if she portrayed herself as a bitter woman who was unsympathetic towards her own father, hostile readers would use her bitterness in ad feminam rebuttals of everything she stood for. For a year after the end of the First World War, life continued much as usual in the Boulevard du Montparnasse. But by the summer of 1919 the Beauvoir family could make no more economies. They moved to a flat in the Rue de Rennes, number 71. On the 5th floor, it was dark and dirty, and had no lift, no running water, no bathroom and no central heating. Although their father still had a study in addition to the parental bedroom and reception rooms, Simone had no space to call her own. The sisters shared a room so tiny that the gap between their beds only allowed them to stand one at a time. They still had Louise. At first, the 6th floor of their building had rooms for the servants of its occupants. But soon after Louise was married and moved to the Rue Madame and Fran, Oise had to run her dilapidated apartment alone. At first she attributed this state of affairs to the difficulty of finding good help. But the truth was that the family couldn't afford to look. This was a clear sign of the depths to which they had fallen. One of the ways of distinguishing between the haute bourgeoisie and the middle class was that the former always had at least one live-in servant. The latter never did. Fran Boyce had always had a temper, but in the Rue de Rennes she lost it more and more frequently, while at the same time attempting to turn indignity into an opportunity for virtue. She began to show neglect and contempt for her body. The girls, too, wore worn and dirty dresses. But this was not a cause of shame in the mind of their mother, who had begun to calculate life in a different currency. They may have had little cash, but they had culture and piety, commodities of much greater value. As a woman, Simone de Beauvoir would be remembered for her distinctive style, and as a novelist and memoirist her prose is textured with textiles, whether the material of a woman's dress or the pattern of a Mexican blanket. But as girls, both Simone and Hl remembered suffering, from lack of elegance for much of their childhoods and later life. Simone referred to their situation as one of semi-poverty. There were other girls at the Cours des Sœurs who were poorly dressed on account of their decent poverty. After all, no respectable girl should dress in a way that could attract accusations of coquetry, but their classmates observed that Simone de Beauvoir was dressed even worse. Even after she had escaped from its scarcity, Beauvoir's childhood left her with a lasting sense of economy. At school, her notebooks became so crammed with tiny handwriting that her teachers complained. She was frugal not only with money and material things, but with herself. I remained convinced that one must make use of everything, and of oneself, to the utmost. She applied herself to her studies, and simultaneously learned the ways of a good Catholic girl. Her efforts were so successful that the chaplain praised her mother for the radiant beauty of her soul. She joined a lay religious order for children, called the Angels of the Passion. In her own words, I had made a definite metamorphosis into a good little girl. Right from the start, I had composed the personality I wished to present to the world. It had brought me so much praise and so many great satisfactions that I had finished by identifying myself with the character I had built up. It was my one reality. But she irritated many of her classmates. She was a know-it-all with a healthy dose of holier-than-thou. Although Beauvoir's relationship with religion would become increasingly ambivalent as she approached her 20s, in childhood it inspired her to question the role of girls in her society. In the sight of God, she wrote in Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, her soul was no less precious than those of little boys, so why should she envy them? In a 1965 interview, Beauvoir reiterated that her strict religious upbringing helped her enormously precisely because she thought of herself as a soul. At the level of souls, she said, there was no variable valuation of human beings. God would have loved me as much if I had been a man. There was no difference between male and female saints. It was a completely asexual domain. Before encountering intellectual egalitarianism, Beauvoir wrote, she found in her religion a species of moral, spiritual equality that counted for a lot in the shaping of her life's convictions. But a dissonance dawned in her awareness between equality preached and inequality practiced. She remembered her father saying with pride, Simone has a man's brain, she thinks like a man, she is a man. Then yet, she objected, everyone treated me like a girl. As she grew, Beauvoir noted that her father's interest in her education increased and so did his interest in her appearance. Beauvoir wrote in her memoirs that she began to take an interest in the sort of figure I thought I should cut in life, taking inspiration from Jo March and Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. Even at the age of 11, Beauvoir was captivated by her. Jo was not the most virtuous or beautiful of her sisters, but her passion for learning and desire to write shone like a beacon in the imagination of the young Simone. Georges de Beauvoir saw things differently. As long as he approved of her, Beauvoir felt she could be sure of herself. But gradually the years of flowing praise gave way to disappointment. He appreciated elegance and beauty in women. Her sister demonstrated these qualities to a higher degree, and so she, like Amy in Little Women, won affirmation and affection. Simone, like Jo, threw herself into books. She read religious works, The Imitation of Christ, a handbook of ascetic and mystical theology and parentally approved works of history and literature, French and English. She loved English literature, reading Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan as a child, honing skills she would later use to read the Brontes in Virginia Woolf in their native tongue. Over time, her parents' prohibitions and her cousin Madeline's insinuations led her to realize that books could teach her things her parents wouldn't. Madeline was allowed to read whatever she wanted to. What was she missing? When left alone in the flat, she raided the bookshelves, reading her father's worn copies of Bourget, Alphonse Daudet, Marcel Piat-Vast, Maupassant and the Goncourts. They supplemented her sexual education. Novels also helped her see the questions hanging unanswered in the world around her. Jo March did not want to do housework because it kept her from what she loved, so why did so many women do it when so few men did? Convention told her that marriage was her future. But Jo March resisted this unwanted fate. Could she? 2. George Eliot's The Mill on the Floss, which Beauvoir read at the tender age of 11 or 12, raised other questions that would recur in her life and her philosophy. Eliot's character Maggie Tulliver hated wasting her time on the repetitive labor of patchwork, where the same stitches had to be sewn again and again. How, if this domestic drudgery was what was expected of her, could Beauvoir be faithful to both herself and the desires of others? If love meant that women sacrificed much and men little, was it worth it? In Beauvoir's student diaries in 1926, she was still pondering the question of how much of herself to keep and how much to give away. Maggie Tulliver had fallen in love with the unworthy Stephen, but Beauvoir could not understand her attraction. The only relationship I could imagine was a love-friendship one. In my view, the exchange and discussion of books between a boy and a girl linked them forever. Books offered Beauvoir more than an education. They were a refuge from the physical and emotional deprivation she encountered when she lifted her eyes from the page. They charted paths of resistance to the life that had been mapped out for her, even if they didn't yet lead to places where women could make choices or give and receive bodily affection without shame. While the young Beauvoir was inspired by characters' intellectual lives, she was discomfited by the physical. She was, to use her own word, prudish. She knew her own parents' relationship was physically passionate and later grieved the injustice of her mother's loss when, at the age of 35, her father spurned her for extramarital pleasure. But the young Beauvoir found the sexual a matter of disgust. Love, in my view, had nothing to do with the body. In the 5 years after the move to the Rue de Rennes, Beauvoir experienced the tumult of adolescence, the increasing tensions between her parents, and the end of 2 lives. After marrying, her beloved Louise had a baby, a little boy. But the boy developed bronchial pneumonia and died. It was an abrupt death, the first Simone had ever known, and she found it terrifying. Louise and her husband lived in a single room in a 6th-floor garret with their child. When they went to visit her afterwards, she saw not only death for the first time, but also the 6th-floor hallway, where the landing had a dozen doors, each of which led to single rooms that housed entire families. Not long afterwards, the concierge's son in the Rue de Rennes became ill. He had tuberculosis and meningitis and died a painful and protracted death. Simone and her family daily watched his decline. Anyone who entered or exited the building had to pass the sick child on the way to the staircase. She worried, since children were dying, that she or H.L. would be next. Beauvoir would later write narratives that closely resembled her life in her novels, which has often obscured the line between the facts and fictions of her own biography. In her 1946 novel, The Blood of Others, she revisited these childhood memories of premature death. The novel's protagonist, a man by the name of Jean Blomart, discovers, original Evelyn, he hears the words, "Louise' baby is dead." Once again, I see the twisted staircase, the stone corridor with those many doors, all alike. Mother told me that behind every door there was a room in which a whole family lived. We went in. Louise took me in her arms, her cheeks were flabby and wet. Mother sat on the bed beside her and began to talk to her in a low voice. In the cradle was a white-faced baby with closed eyes. I looked at the red tiles, at the bare walls, at the gas ring, and I began to cry. I was crying, Mother was talking, and the baby remained dead. How, Beauvoir asks a few pages later, can he smile when he knows Louise is weeping? Throughout her life, Beauvoir would find herself aghast at the scandal of human indifference to the suffering of others. At home, however, Simone wished that her mother would show her daughters a little more indifference. Both sisters described their adolescence as painful, and their relationships with their mother as particularly tense. From the age of 12 or 13, Simone found her hostile and even unbearable. Elney described her concept of motherhood as totally tyrannical and thought that she wanted to live through her daughters, and for her daughters to live for her, a desire they were unwilling to fulfill. It is not difficult to understand their unwillingness. Their mother played the dutiful wife while their father's behavior became ever more objectionable. Bridge in the afternoon had already given way to bridge after dinner. He spent more and more of his hours and his earnings on drinking and games while Fran always scrimped to meet the needs of their household. By daylight, Simone and Elney watched their mother struggle to provide and care for them, and their father make scenes when she asked for housekeeping money. After nightfall they heard late homecomings, fights, and talk of brothels, mistresses, gambling. In A Very Easy Death, Beauvoir recounted her mother's loss of patience with the situation. Eventually, Madame de Beauvoir would slap and needle her husband, making scenes in private and public alike. Later in life, Beauvoir reflected on the way her mother felt torn between contradictory desires. It is impossible for anyone to say, I am sacrificing myself without feeling bitterness. One of Maman's contradictions was that she thoroughly believed in the nobility of devotion, while at the same time she had tastes, aversions and desires that were too masterful for her not to loathe whatever went against them. She was continually rebelling against the restraints and the privations that she inflicted upon herself. How to resolve these conflicting desires, to live a life of devotion to others or to live life for oneself, was to become one of the central questions of Beauvoir's student diaries. Existentialist ethics and feminism. Madame de Beauvoir was a devout Catholic woman who raised her daughter on a spiritual diet of saints and martyrs. This provided Simone with a catalogue of exemplary lives in which self-sacrifice was always a key ingredient. In some cases, this self-sacrifice resulted in apotheosis. Making oneself nothing was the way to become divine. Simone began to find solitude the most exalting state. She wanted to reign alone over her own life. Religious refrains would reverberate in her later works, as would her mother's loss of prestige. Although she does not claim it to be autobiographical, there is a passage in The Second Sex where Beauvoir discusses the rebellion of daughters as especially violent when daughters have watched their mothers sacrifice themselves on undeserving altars. They see that in reality this thankless role does not lead to any apotheosis. Victim, she is scorned; shrew, she is detested. Her daughter wants not to take after her. The circumstances at home were increasingly stressful, but school still offered stability and one companionship that rivaled even the deliciousness of solitude. Jaja's friendship continued to bring Simone pleasure and confidence. They were competitive, studious and, dubbed, the inseparables, be their teachers and peers. Their fathers were of the same social class, and by some miracle Madame Lecointe endeared herself to Madame de Beauvoir, so the girls were allowed to go to the Lecointes for visits. The Lecointes did not know about the Beauvoirs' relative poverty, and the Beauvoirs did not know about the Lecointes' relative informality at home. Their children were allowed to run and jump indoors, to overturn furniture. But apart from Elney, who initially felt displaced by the presence of Jaja in Simone's affections, all parties were satisfied that this friendship was suitable. Both girls were interested in ideas. Simone could talk with Jaja about the things that interested her and voice her questions aloud. Simone usually came in first place in academic subjects at school, but Jaja beat her in athletics and music. As they grew into young women together, Jaja became increasingly pretty and graceful. Simone's face grew blotchy and her body awkward. This changed when Simone was around 17, but at the time she was self-consciously aware that her friend's life had many physical, financial and familial charms that were conspicuously absent from her own. They shared a great deal, but Simone's desire for closeness was not fully reciprocated, in part because Jaja wanted a kind of relationship with her mother that Simone either did not want or could not have. Jaja had a full life, with 8 siblings and a successful father. But she only felt special when she was singled out in her mother's attention. Simone believed that Jaja was Madame Lecoin's only confidant once. In a rare moment of intimacy, Jaja told Simone that her mother had told her about the horror of her wedding night. Madame Lecoin told her daughter that she was disgusted by sex and that the conceptions of her 9 children had all been devoid of passion. Madame Lecoin had only had an elementary education. And while it was fine for Jaja to get good grades, it was more important that she assume her family responsibilities. For these would prepare her for her own future as a wife. She expected her to make the best marriage in the family. Simone had always been perplexed by the dynamics of this family, but she was taken aback one summer when she went to visit Jaja at the Lecoin's estate in the lands. When she arrived, Jaja was confined to a sofa with a large gash on her leg. Once they were alone, Jaja admitted that the wound was self-inflicted. She had hit her own leg with an axe. Why? Beauvoir asked. Because she wanted to be free of the expectations of her able-bodied self. Social visits, garden parties, watching her younger siblings. Although she didn't mention Jaja by name, Beauvoir would write this incident, too, into The Second Sex. As Simone and Hlne grew older, their shared loneliness gave way to shared resentment. The sisters were also beginning to rebel, albeit in less violent ways. They sneaked out of the apartment when their parents weren't home to have café amis at La Rodin, a place whose glamorous clientele had fascinated them for hours as they watched from the balcony of their flat. When their parents were home, it was increasingly clear that their father took it to be a sign of personal failure that his daughters required formal qualifications. Had they had dowries, they could have aspired to good marriages rather than employment. After the First World War, this situation was far from unique. The dowries of many bourgeois Frenchwomen had been destroyed by inflation, and education was the necessary path in ensuring that they would have the means to live. But this did not stop people of Simone's parents' class thinking it was beneath them for their daughters to receive higher education. For them, training for a profession was a sign of defeat. Simone's father's early pleasure in her precocious intelligence was rooted in his expectation that it would help her shine in the glittering social spheres of his childhood. To succeed there, a woman needed to be beautiful, of course, and to be well-read in order to be a good conversationalist. He liked intelligence and wit, but he did not like intellectuals and women's rights. Even so, eventually the reality sunk in that, unlike her cousin Jean, who would go on to be the telling of the family estate, Simone would inherit nothing. He used to say to his daughters that they would never marry, announcing with bitterness in his voice that they would have to work for their living. So Simone confronted confusingly contradictory expectations. To succeed as a woman, she must be accomplished and educated, but not too accomplished, not too educated. Her mother's wishes provided her with a catch-22 of a different kind. Since their household had no servants, Fran always would have liked her daughter help. But Simone needed to study to succeed, and refused to spend time learning the feminine skills she had no desire whatsoever to employ. The anger and ambivalence Fran always felt at her own situation was often unleashed on Simone. Everywhere Simone looked, she felt the weight of the expectations of others. Often these were oppressive. Occasionally they would let in fresh air instead of shutting it out. Jacques Champagnol, Simone de Beauvoir's childhood fiancé, admired both Beauvoir sisters as they were, and continued to pursue their conversation when their father no longer considered them worthy interlocutors. Jacques' father owned a stained glass manufacturing plant on the Boulevard du Montparnasse, and he frequently visited the Beauvoirs. Georges listened to him, treating him like an adult. Fran always loved his manners. When Georges no longer found Simone's ideas interesting or amusing, reminding him, as they did, of his own failure, Jacques filled the conversational gap. At first Simone was puzzled by the way they would sit in the drawing room. Jacques and Georges would discuss something interesting while the women, much like Maggie Tulliver, were expected to sit quietly and sew or sketch. Initially Jacques deferred to Georges, but then became more liberal and more vocal, challenging his uncle's conservatism. So Georges decided not to delay his nightly bridge game by staying in the apartment to chat. He dismissed Jacques to his daughters. This intended slight delighted the cousins. Now they could be together, exchanging ideas and books more freely. Conversations with Jacques led Simone to realize that her body was not the only attractive thing about her. A man might be, in fact, this man was attracted to her mind. But Jacques' attentions were hot and cold. Sometimes he visited regularly and sometimes he was absent for unexplained and prolonged periods of time. Although she later downplayed the relationship, claiming in Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter that she looked on him as a sort of elder brother. For a long time Simone dreamed of a future with him, and even at the time of meeting Sartre, he was one of the three men who, in different ways, vied for her affections. Although it lasted for years, Simone's desire for Jacques may have arisen as a response to parallel movements in the life of Jaja, whose mother had started introducing her daughter to one man after another. This repulsed Jaja, who didn't see the difference between marrying for convenience and prostitution. She had been taught to respect her body, and it seemed to her that whatever financial or family reasons there may be, it was not respectful to give it to a man without love. And yet, in the Lecoin family there were two paths open to women: a marriage or a convent. Jaja was beginning to dread both. Nevertheless, her family, with dowries of more than 250,000 francs for each of their 5 daughters, were identifying potential suitors in a systematic fashion. The Beauvoirs were in no position to do the same. So in later years Simone thought Jacques was her way of coping to keep in step with Jaja. She imagined her love for him. But those around her at the time, and, indeed, her diaries from the late 1920s, attested to the strength of her feelings for him. They also expressed indignation at his treatment of her. Elni thought Jacques played the coquette, and that he wasn't worthy of her sister. These romantic courtships and confusions unfolded in the context of sweeping educational reforms in France, and significant decisions about Beauvoir's future. Simone graduated from the Cours des Sœurs in 1924. 10 years earlier, a teacher in a girls' like E wrote that education and employment were becoming necessities for women. The majority of girls now have the intention of continuing their studies to prepare themselves for some profession. This is natural. Nearly all desire love and marriage and motherhood. But they know that in our unjust society, dominated by the cult of gold, not every girl will be able to realize the motherly life that ought to be the norm for every woman. They understand that instruction will open careers for them, which will enable them, if need be, to support themselves without masculine aid. For Beauvoir, the promise of masculine aid through marriage was much less certain than that of her own abilities. She knew herself to be reliable in a way that masculine aid, at least as instantiated by her father, was not. She studied hard, accumulating qualifications rapidly. At 16, in July 1924, she received her premier baccalaureate, a school-leaving certificate that had only recently been conferred to women on the same terms as men with distinction. When she went to pick up her certificate, an examiner acidly mocked her. "Have you come to pick up a few more diplomas?" The Cours des Sœurs, although conservative in many respects, was one of the leading institutions encouraging women to complete the first and second baccalaureates. After the first baccalaureate, bright students like Simone were encouraged to stay on for a year to qualify in subjects like philosophy, literature, or science, which enabled them to teach in similar schools. This course was intended to make a virtue of necessity. It was a lower status option than marriage, but at least the women who followed it stayed within the bourgeois circles of their birth. The second examination was much more rigorous. The headmistress had recently added philosophy to the curriculum, since it was popular in the like S and she wanted to boost her enrollments. A priest taught the course, and although Simone loved the subject, she found its delivery woefully inadequate. He merely read or dictated passages from philosophical texts, and Simone complained in the Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter that everything ended with "the truth," according to St. Thomas Aquinas. Even so, she was captivated by philosophy and wanted to study more. She had had her first taste of it, and all the other disciplines she had excelled in now seemed poor relations. Simone passed the second baccalaureate, but this time without distinction. Georges took her to the theater to celebrate. He was beginning to take a bit more of an interest in her. Perhaps because her face had cleared up and she was growing slim, he placed undue significance on such things. And perhaps because the practical questions of her future were becoming unavoidable. He did not approve of her studying philosophy, which he thought was gibberish. Frandoise objected for other reasons. She did not want her daughter to be morally corrupted or lose her faith. But Simone had made up her mind. She had read about an elite training school at withThe, which was established to educate women as teachers for the state like St. colleges. Fran boys would hear none of it. She had heard rumors about the strict exercise, lax morals and irreligiosity of this place. Simone's parents had spent years paying for a private education, and did not want her to waste their investment by becoming a functionary of the state school system. To top it all off, withThe's students boarded, which meant they could not be closely supervised by their mothers. Georges saw no intrinsic value in philosophy, but he conceded that it might provide a good grounding for a career in law, which had become open to a few women since the war. If Simone qualified for a legal position in the civil service, her income would be guaranteed for life. Not being one to make rushed judgments, Simone read the Napoleonic Code before giving her answer, which was crystal clear: no. Her mother suggested training as a librarian. Again, Simone's answer was resolute: no. She was determined to study philosophy. They were determined that she would not. So Simone resorted to a campaign of silence. Whenever they tried to discuss her future, she said nothing. As time passed, the window for avoiding embarrassment grew smaller and the air grew thicker. Her parents finally capitulated, but not without shouting matches. One day, in a magazine, Simone found an image of the future she wanted. There was an article about the first woman Dr. d'État in France, l'intelligente. The picture accompanying it showed her in a thoughtful pose at her desk, and the article said that she lived with an adopted niece. This woman was both intellectual and responsive to what Beauvoir called the demands of female sensibility. Someday, she dreamed of having such things written about her. But if Simone had been just a few years older, nothing might have been written about her at all. 5 years earlier, she would not even have been able to take the qualifying exam. She knew her chosen road was not well traveled by women. At this point, only 6 women had passed the agrégation in philosophy. It was a highly competitive national exam, and Beauvoir wanted to be one of those pioneers who passed it. Very little of Beauvoir's writing survives from this early period of her education. But there is one essay, written at the end of 1924, analyzing a classic text in the philosophy of science, Claude Bernard's Introduction to the Study of Experimental Medicine. In it, the 16-year-old Beauvoir wrote that the most interesting part of his interesting work was the way Bernard valued philosophical doubt. Bernard wrote that the great experimental principle is doubt, that philosophical doubt, which leaves to the mind its freedom and initiative. He thought that some forms of skepticism were barren, but that there was a kind of fertile doubt which recognized the limitations of the human mind. Our mind is so limited that we can know neither the beginning nor the end of things. But we can grasp the middle, i.e., what surrounds us classically. Beauvoir's philosophy textbook at school, Manuel de Philosophie by Father Charles Lar, had also discussed doubt. But it warned against taking it too far, since doubt could corrupt or even extinguish religious faith. Already as a student, Beauvoir was rejecting a certain way of doing philosophy for enslaving the mind and systems, taking away its freedom. This early interest in the philosophy of freedom is very important for understanding Beauvoir's later personal decisions, her philosophy, and the way her life has been misunderstood. In the 1920s, she also read Alfred Feuillée, a 19th-century philosopher who disagreed with his better-known compatriot, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, about freedom. Feuillée argued that man isn't born, but rather becomes freed. He claimed that freedom is an idea force, which is to say an idea that has the power to shape the evolution of an individual. Feuillée was interested in the age-old question of whether human actions are free or determined, whether we make our fates or are destined to them. Against those who think human beings are determined to act in certain ways, Feuillée argued that the human desire for freedom itself enables us to become free. Others worried that desire and emotion compromise freedom. But Feuillée claimed that the desire for freedom was unlike all other human desires, because the desire for freedom opposed the influence of other desires. The desire for freedom leads human beings to want not the good or even a good decision, but rather a decision that is uniquely mine. Beauvoir wanted her future to be her decision. She wanted to live a life of freedom, and she wanted to study philosophy. When her mother told the teachers at Cours de Sur Simone's chosen subject, the nuns stoked the fire of her maternal anxiety, saying that 1 year at the Sorbonne would ruin Mademoiselle de Beauvoir's faith and character. So the family made a compromise: she would start by studying literature. In 1925, the most prestigious path to her chosen profession was closed to her. Women were not accepted at the École Normale Supérieure, which trained the Siami de la Siami of the Parisian philosophical elite. She would have to do a license at the Sorbonne, then a teaching diploma, then the agrégation. In 1925 she began studying mathematics at the Institut Catholique, and literature and languages at the Institut Sainte-Marie. Both institutions prepared Catholic students for the Sorbonne's exams and were intended to limit pupils' exposure to the dangers of its secular culture. Madame de Beauvoir did not know how excellent her choice of institution would be for her daughter. She chose the Institut Sainte-Marie for its Catholic respectability. But here Simone was under the tutelage of Madeleine Danilou, a woman who held more degrees than any other in France. She believed that education was the key to liberation. She was married to a member of the French Parliament who shared her ideas, Charles Danilou. Françoise, who had more free time now that her daughters were older and Georges was so rarely at home, dedicated her time to reading and learning, and she followed Simone's studies. Françoise was intelligent, and the more she read the more she admired Madame Danilou's curriculum. Simone found this attention bittersweet. She knew her mother wanted their relationship to be one of friendship, and to have the closeness that she had never had with her own mother. But she attempted to achieve this proximity by force rather than by invitation, provoking resentment and withdrawal. According to H.L. Nee, Françoise opened and read all of Simone's letters, even when she was 18, and threw away those she found unsuitable. Simone's already minuscule handwriting grew even tinier, as if she wanted the words in her notebooks to be invisible to her mother's prying eyes. The sisters felt stifled, which made it all the more surprising. One day, when Jacques came back to the Rue de Rennes, and Madame de Beauvoir loosened her reins. He hadn't been to visit for almost a year, but he had just bought a sporty car, and wanted to show it off. He was a man in need of an audience, and Simone listened eagerly to his opinions on writers she hadn't yet read and the gossip about the writers and artists who lived in Montparnasse. H.L. Nee quickly realized that he wasn't there to see her, and she saw by her sister's blushes that Jacques' interest was reciprocated. When Jacques suggested taking Simone out in the car, H.L. Nee was shocked that Françoise gave her permission. H.L. Nee resented being left behind, but it meant that she was home to witness her mother's ecstasy after the cousins departed. Françoise hoped Jacques might marry Simone, dowry or no dowry. What followed was, to all appearances, a courtship, the only traditional courtship in Simone de Beauvoir's life. With Jacques she drove around Paris, walked in the Bois de Boulogne, read banned books, visited galleries, discovered music. Then, all of a sudden, Françoise stopped them going out alone. She hoped the absence might make Jacques grow fonder, but she was also beginning to be suspicious. Simone had begun to discover nightclubs and cafes, and her clothes smelled of tobacco and alcohol. That year Simone passed her exams with good marks, and her philosophy instructor encouraged her to continue at the Institut Sainte-Marie and to follow as many courses as she could at the Sorbonne. She had passed exams for 3 certificates of higher studies in mathematics, French literature, and Latin. To put this achievement in perspective, the average license comparable to a bachelor's degree was composed of 4 certificates, and the average student would earn 1 certificate per year. Meanwhile, Jacques had failed his law examinations, so would have to repeat the year's work. He was lazy and starting to drink a lot. But Simone overlooked these defects in character. She didn't want to admit he was stringing her along. Their relationship was not physical, they never even kissed. He was often absent and even when present, aloof, but Beauvoir attributed his distance to defects in herself rather than him. As a mature woman, it is hard to imagine her reading her diaries from this period without disappointment. She drew heavily on them in writing her memoirs of a dutiful daughter, and in her mature philosophy. Jacques did speak of marriage vaguely, saying things like, "It seems I will have to marry soon." But an actual proposal never came. Beauvoir later wondered why she wanted it so badly, reflecting that her reasons were probably instrumental. Through marriage she might finally earn her family's love and respect. Her heart was divided. In her diaries she contrasted her imaginary life as Madame Jacques Champagnole with what she called a life of freedom. She spent the summer of 1926 struggling to be happy, even in the country with her relatives. When she returned to Paris in September she wanted to see Jacques, but Fran always forbade it. That summer, at the age of 18, she made her first attempts at writing a novel, Liaison, but she only wrote 9 pages. Although philosophy was becoming her passion, she did not want to create a grand philosophical system, but rather to write the novel of the inner life. She wanted to show what was happening within the rich worlds of her characters. This project was inspired in part by reading the philosopher Henry Bergson, who celebrated a bold novelist in his time and free will. He described, and Beauvoir quoted in her diary, the way literature can tear aside the cleverly woven web of our conventional self. When she read him she had a great intellectual rapture because she saw in his philosophy not the logical constructions but palpable reality. In her diary Beauvoir wrote that she wanted to think life, to transpose her questions into fiction. And over the next 2 years she continued to refine her efforts in several short stories. Her commitment to attentive descriptions of experience was typical of the kind of phenomenology she would become interested in as a philosopher. Phenomenology, the study of the structures of consciousness from a first-person point of view, would also shape the methodology of her feminism, and she would reshape it for feminist ends. But in 1927 she wanted to write essays on life, which would not be a novel, but philosophy, linking them together vaguely with a fiction. In the prime of life, 1960, Beauvoir wrote that she was not the philosopher Sartre was. But her diaries show that in the summer of 1926 she had an experience that shocked her, made her feel ashamed, and led her to reflect philosophically on something that would become a central theme of her mature work. She wouldn't meet Sartre until 3 years later, and over time this theme would come to play a significant role in his work, too. She was making a pilgrimage to Lourdes with her aunt when she saw the physical suffering of the sick who sought healing. She was overwhelmed, feeling disgust at all the intellectual and sentimental elegance before the invalids, and that her own sorrows were nothing compared with their physical pain and distress. She felt ashamed in that moment, and thought that a life of complete self-giving, even self-abnegation, was the only appropriate response. But then, after reflection, she concluded that she was wrong. In her diary she urges herself not to be ashamed of living. She has been given a life and it is her duty to live it in the best possible way. To give herself away completely, in fact, would be moral suicide. But it would also be easier than deciding how much of herself to give and how much to keep. She called what was needed equilibrium, in which people gave themselves without annihilating the consciousness of themselves in order to serve others. She wanted to live a life of self-giving without self-loss. 6 days later she returned to this theme in her diaries, discussing 2 poles of possibility: devotion and egoism. Given her childhood experiences, it is tempting to read these poles along parental or gendered lines. Her mother's abject devotion and her father's unrepentant egoism are not mentioned in the diaries. But given what she would later write about her parents, it is clear that one thing she inherited from her childhood home was an intense sense of injustice. In the diaries, Beauvoir writes that she wants to be devoted to others because she has a liking for beings. She wanted her emotions to agree with her ideas. So she asked herself, could a moral code be built on appreciation for others? Whether or not it was sufficient for others. She decided it was sufficient for her. Certainly, I am very individualistic. But is this incompatible with the devotion and disinterested love of others? It seems to me that there is one part of me that is made to be given away, another that is made to be kept and cultivated. The second part is valid in itself and guarantees the value of the other. At 18 she was dissatisfied by philosophical discussions that remained in a vacuum, and was already reflecting on the distance between knowing something intellectually and feeling it in real life. Literature, she thought, bridged the gap. The writer pleases me when he rediscovers life. The philosopher when he rediscovers the writer who will serve as an intermediary with life. Beauvoir wanted to serve as such an intermediary, and in particular to show how human beings are dualities taught can be seen from within and from without, both intensely inner and yet engaged in the world with others. She tried writing another novel in September, and this time finished a 68-page manuscript called Tentative Existence, An Attempted Existence. During the autumn of 1926, Beauvoir continued to wrestle with her affection for Jacques. At this stage she sincerely believed a reciprocal love was possible between them. What Beauvoir wanted, in her own words, was a love that accompanies me through life, not that absorbs all my life. She thought that love should not make all else disappear, but should simply tint it with new nuances. Although she was soon to change her mind, she thought she might marry someday, and that under the right circumstances marriage might be a great and beautiful thing. But her mother annoyed her. She didn't think things with Jacques were moving quickly enough and worried about a precise conclusion, a proposal. Fran always schemed, sending Simone on errands so that her path would cross Jacques'. She thought this would make Simone happy, but in fact it made her squirm. In November, she wrote in her diary, "How little I myself choose. How much life imposes itself upon me. My life to which after all I have to resign myself." As her mother pushed her along the path of propriety, Beauvoir wrote in her diaries that every position in life was acceptable, but to have value, it had to be valued by the person adopting it. It was painfully clear that she did not see love, life and happiness the way her parents did. She didn't want to walk through life unthinkingly doing what was proper, reading what was suitable. By 1926 she had come to the conclusion that she could only genuinely have esteem for beings who think there lives, not for those who only think, or for those who only live. According to Dierder, shortly after the new year of 1927, Fran always decided that Simone's birthday should be commemorated with a photo portrait. Birthdays were often marked in this way, but Simone knew that her mother had another agenda. Jacques. Instead of the traditional birthday pose, Fran arranged her daughter in the traditional posture of an engagement announcement, holding flowers in a hand that ought to bear her fiancé's ring. Jacques accepted a copy of the portrait graciously, and that was that. Fran was fuming. We don't know how Simone felt about this, possibly because she did not record it and possibly because it didn't happen. Sylvie Le Bon de Beauvoir denied the existence of such a photo, and Beauvoir's diaries are silent on the subject, with no entries from early December 1926 to April of 1927. But the story as Bear tells it does not end there. In the spring of 1927, Elmi graduated from the Cours de Sir, and the sisters, who had grown apart somewhat during the periods when Jacques distracted Simone's attention, were again unified against their mother's irascibility. Fran's anxiety about Jacques was noxious. She felt frustrated and powerless because the cards were all in his hand. When her confused emotions were not channeled into sarcasm and scorn for her daughter, they erupted on a humiliating scale. One night, frustrated after a proposal-less dinner with the Champignons, Fran returned home. She paced for several hours, then screamed that she would deliver her daughter from disgrace and left the apartment. Georges was home, but didn't get out of bed. Elmi woke up, threw on clothes, and chased her mother down the Boulevard du Montparnasse. Fran stopped in front of the Champignon residence, shouting. The noise woke Simone, who rushed down to the street. The daughters silently escorted their shrieking mother back inside. From the vantage point of the 21st century, this story, if true, raises questions about Fran de Beauvoir's mental health. Later, the female characters in Beauvoir's works often felt trapped, sometimes hovering on the verge of madness. We know from both sisters' memoirs that in the period from 1926 to 1927 they were gradually allowed to venture out more without suitors or chaperones. Simone went to read in the ladies-only section at the Bibliothèque Saint Geneviève v. Lucretius, Juvenal, Diderot, and began teaching at a social service institute called the Équipe Sociales, which was founded by a young philosophy professor to help the working classes in northeast Paris. Her mother approved of such philanthropic pursuits, so Simone gave the impression of teaching more nights than she actually did in order to escape the house. She walked around Paris some evenings, and on others she went to watch Elni paint and draw. Her sister's world had expanded in fascinating directions. At the Equipes Sociales and Elni's life drawing classes she saw men and women discussing their ideas and dreams, confidently nude models and their nonplussed observers. The sisters had never been exposed to so many, and such diverse, people. In addition to Gide and Proust, Jacques had introduced Simone to cocktails. Now she made herself a habitué of bars. Simone and Elni continued to visit La Rodent, sometimes skipping art classes and teaching to spend evening hours in bars and cafes instead. Simone now had a little money at her disposal because she had taken a job as a teaching assistant at the Institut Sainte-Marie. It wasn't much, but she could cover her expenses and books and have a small amount left over. Despite distress at home and distractions at night, she continued to shine in her studies. In March 1927 Simone passed her certificate in the history of philosophy. In April she reflected that this year had brought her a serious philosophical formation that sharpened her, alas, too penetrating critical mind and her desire for rigor and logic. What, one wonders, made her write this, alas? What is there to object to in having a penetrating mind that values rigor and logic? Did she lament this mind because, as we will see in the next chapter, God became anathema to it? Or because she thought it was anathema to femininity? Her happiness? In June, she received another certificate in general philosophy, coming second to Simone Weil. Weil would become a prominent thinker, whose politics and self-sacrifice inspired many around her, including Albert Camus and Georges Bataille. Philosophically, Beauvoir thought she accepted the conclusions of her teacher, Alain, without enough questioning. The third runner-up in this exam would also become a leading French philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Beauvoir obtained a certificate in Greek as well in just 2 years. She had already earned a license and a half. Writing in Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, Beauvoir claimed that education and success brought more than esteem to her, it brought feelings of profound loneliness and a lack of direction. I was breaking away from the class to which I belonged. Where was I to go? We see this loneliness expressed in the diaries, where she wrote, in May 1927, I am intellectually very alone, and very lost at the entrance to my life. I feel that I have worth, that I have something to do and say. Reflecting on the way that Jacques dismissed her intellectual passions and philosophical seriousness with a smile, she wrote determinedly and highlighted, in the margins, I have only one life and many things to say. He will not steal my life away from me. That day she was thinking about freedom again, writing that, it is only by free decision, and thanks to the interplay of circumstances, that the true self is discovered. People around her talked about making choices, like deciding to marry, as if you did it once and for all. But she never felt like choices were made in that way. Every choice was constantly in the making. It is repeated every time that I become conscious of it. That day she concluded that marriage is fundamentally immoral. How could the self of today make decisions for the self of tomorrow? She could still imagine a life in which she loved Jacques. But she had had a conversation with another man, Charles Barbier, who talked with her about philosophy and literature with intelligent interest instead of dismissive smiles. The experience made her realize that her future held many possibilities. She called them her possibles in French, and that bit by bit, she would have to kill all but one of them, so that on the last day of her life there would be one reality. She would have lived one life. The question was, which life? Instances like these show that from an early age Beauvoir felt a strong sense of vocation and the importance of her own voice. In Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter she would even invoke the language of Hebrew prophets, messengers of God, to express her calling. In one of the relevant stories in the Bible, God needs an emissary and asks the people of Israel, "Whom shall I send?" The prophet Isaiah replies to him, "Here I am. Send me." In the Memoirs, Beauvoir describes a voice that whispered within her, over and over again, "Here I am." God or no God, she knew that what she had to say was important, and she had already begun to realize that some people would try to convince her otherwise, whether through outright confrontation or diminutive dismissals. Simone was determined, but she was not immune to self-doubt and others' expectations of her. Her parents were beginning to make explosive scenes about what she was reading. She began to feel that they did not accept her at all. She had more and more arguments with her father, who talked about sending her away and told her she had no heart, that she was all brain and no feeling. The week before Jacques smilingly dismissed her intellectual passions, she had an argument with her father about what it means to love. He said it was services rendered, affection, gratefulness. She had been reading more now forgotten philosophers Elaine and Jules Lagno and claimed that she had found in Lagno how I would have to live. So many people, she thought, had never known true love, in which reciprocity is necessary. In July, Beauvoir again resolved to clearly spell out my philosophical ideas. She wanted to study in depth the questions that interested her, especially love, which she put in quotation marks in her diary, and the opposition of self and other. For Beauvoir, even at this age, the concept of love was not just a romantic ideal, but an ethical one. In her diary she enjoined herself, "Don't be Simone de Beauvoir. Be me, don't have a goal imposed from outside, a social framework to fill. What works for me will work, and that is all." With Jaja, too, she discussed love. Their shared love of philosophy and a shared concern over their futures brought them closer together than ever. They had been discussing the nature of love in their philosophy class at school, and their discussions continued throughout the week, while visiting museums or playing tennis. The friendships still met with Fran Ois's approval, but Madame Lecoin was starting to worry that Jaja's interest in education was going too far, and Simone was a bad influence in that respect. Jaja wanted to enroll at the Sorbonne instead of pocketing her 250,000 franc dowry. Her parents found this incomprehensible. Slowly Simone began to make other friendships that stretched and softened her world. When she was 20, and on a visit to Jaja's family's country estate in the lands, Beauvoir met Street for Otakovich, their family governess, who would become one of her closest friends. In the eyes of Beauvoir, this Polish Ukrainian emigre was exotic and daring. She was wealthy and well-educated, but chose to work as a governess because she was curious about bourgeois Parisian life. She was not afraid of her sexuality and spoke frankly with Beauvoir about it. When they returned to Paris, they met almost daily. Street lived nearby and worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Translating, she earned a sizable amount, which she was happy to spend on her friends. She laughed Beauvoir out of some of her prudery, simultaneously challenging her reserve and expressing sisterly concern for her naivety. Elney introduced Simone to Geraldine Pardo, whom she had met through her art classes. Gigi, as they called her, was a working-class girl who enjoyed her job so much that she planned to continue working whether she married a man or not. Simone was attracted by Gigi's enthusiasm and eloquence. Gigi helped her see more clearly that social class did not determine human behavior by necessity. But Street's concerns about her naivety proved to be well-founded. Simone started to indulge in adventures, which she thought were innocent pranks, but could have had disastrous consequences. At first Street played too, but what started as accepting drinks from men gave way to more risky behavior, frequenting the seediest bars, going on drives and back to apartments with no intention of delivering to their drunk companions what their drunk companions expected. Although she always managed to disentangle herself, Street was furious that Simone put herself in these situations, and confused that she did so when Simone gave the impression that she was still almost betrothed to Jacques. The 18-year-old Simone was philosophically precocious, but her behavior could be perilously reckless and rather prim. When Simone came to visit Street, who was soon to marry Fernando Gerasi, she was shocked to find him inside her room with the door shut. Wasn't Street worried about her reputation? When Fernando later painted Street nude, Beauvoir was horrified and refused to look at the picture. Her friends found her prudery pompous. She told both Street and Gigi that their opinions and conduct were the sad consequences of their inferior upbringing. This Simone de Beauvoir was easily scandalized. She would have been shocked to see the scenes her later novels and life contained. In her diary, Simone continued to reflect on the question of the equilibrium between self and other. She started to split her existence into two parts, one for others and one for myself. This distinction importantly predates a famous one Sartre would make in Being and Nothingness, 1943, between being for itself and being for others. Many have mistakenly seen Sartre's distinction at work in Beauvoir's novels and in The Second Sex. But Beauvoir arrived this way of seeing things early and independently. In the 1927-28 academic year, Beauvoir planned to do 3 more certificates in order to gain a double license in classics and philosophy. She didn't always enjoy the demands she made of herself, sometimes complaining that so much of her time was spent at home or in the library. She felt like a rat on a treadmill. In March 1928 she gained the remaining 2 qualifications in philosophy, ethics and psychology, but she found philology the remaining requirement for classics too dry and dull to deserve persistence. She decided she didn't need the classics license. Her father objected if she was not going to be conventionally successful in marriage she might as well be as unconventionally successful as possible. But she stood her ground and ditched classics. Her brilliance was unquestionable, and it was beginning to attract attention. Maurice Merleau-Ponty wanted to meet the young bourgeois who had beat him in general philosophy. Of course, 2 women had beat him in general philosophy, but Simone Weil was Jewish, so not a contender for the kind of intellectual friendship 2 Catholics could share, or so he thought. Neither Simone would become a Catholic woman in any conventional sense, but Weil would be remembered as a woman of fervent faith, Beauvoir of avid atheism.